So this is Chapter 19, Forest and Land Management, presented by Sarah.
Lindsay.
Evan.
And Blake.
So starting off, we're going to discuss the economic and ecological principles of forest management. And a key characteristic of forest growth to consider before we get into sort of the finer details is that when discussing forest management policies, forests are cumulative in nature. So this means that most of the biomass that has accumulated over a given time period, as long as it is not disturbed, will still be available to provide ecosystem services or for humans to use in the future. Ecosystem services, as we've discussed in other chapters, are services provided by forests that include carbon storage, water retention, and maintenance of biodiversity. The time at which forests and lumber are harvested is an important factor to consider in forest management for these reasons. Um, Sustainable forest management is defined as the use of specific policy to manage a forest in a way that ensures a consistent flow of economic value without affecting the physical stock of the forest. Stock refers to a variable's quantity at a given point in time, so you can sort of think of it as like a snapshot in time, and it can be converted into currency all at the same time. An example of this is clear cutting, which is the process of harvesting all trees in a given area, typically at the same time. And then flow is a variable's quantity measured over a period of time. So you could sort of think of this as the time lapse compared to stock's snapshot. And this includes physical flows, such as the flow of a river past a certain point, measured in cubic feet per second, or financial flows like income over a period of time. Standing forests represent both stock and flow resources, and determining the economically preferable time to harvest the timber requires consideration of the discount rate, ecosystem service values, and other use values and non-use values. So now looking at an example from the textbook, which is not considering forest replanting and regrowth. Say that there's a forest with 100,000 tons of standing timber and a growth rate of 5,000 additional tons per year. The net price per ton of timber is $100 per ton. If the forest is clear cut, its value is equal to $10 million. But if the timber is harvested using sustainable forest management, where the amount harvested annually does not exceed the annual growth, then the forest would produce $500,000 per year. Now we're moving on to the discount rate to calculate the present value, which the simplified formula is present value is equal to the dollar amount divided by the discount rate. So using a 4% discount rate, this would be $500,000 divided by 4%, which would be a resulting revenue of 12.5 million. So in this case, it is economically preferable to use sustainable forest management over clear cutting. But in a 6% discount rate, this would only yield $8.33 million, so it would be economically preferable to clear cut. And this just demonstrates how financial variables such as commercial interest rate have a significant impact on private forest management policies. So if the owner of the forest harvests the timber through clear cutting, they could invest their $10 million revenue at 6% to earn $600,000 per year. And this is, of course, $100,000 more than what they would earn by harvesting the timber through sustainable forest management. So, in kind of simplify all this information, the higher the potential interest rate, the more likely a private forest owner will be incentivized to clear cut it and invest their profits. So, when the discount rate increases, the present value of sustainable management option decreases. Now, we are going to consider forest replanting and regrowth. So, a young forest will grow at a greater rate than a mature forest, and therefore we have to consider a forest's mean annual increment. The mean annual increment is the average growth rate of a forest, and it can be calculated by dividing the total weight of timber by the forest's age. So on a graph, like you can see at right, the MAI is defined as by the slope of a straight line that starts at the origin and extends to that point. So basically comparing the logistic curve to just a simple linear one. So one possibility for harvesting a forest would be to clear cut it at the period of time determined by the MAI. This would produce the highest average annual revenue, assuming a constant price for timber. This does not take into account the cost of harvesting, which would include cost of labor, machinery, and the energy necessary to harvest and transport the timber, and it also does not account for the discount rate for both revenues and costs. To calculate the economic optimum, you should first find the total revenue and the total cost for harvesting at a given amount of timber, where the total revenue is equal to the volume of timber multiplied by a per unit price per ton, and the TC will be higher than TR initially because of fixed costs such as machinery, These costs will continue to increase in proportion to the amount of timber harvested over time, which includes replanting costs. Total revenue minus total costs is the harvesting profit at a future given point. And the graphs to the right sort of illustrate that difference of just regular total revenue and total cost versus the undiscounted and the discounted versions. Um, so then the next step would be discounting future expected profits to calculate the present value. The optimal rotation period occurs when the discounted value of total revenue minus total costs is maximized. This is also the economic profitability viewpoint. And an increase in the discount rate leads to a decrease in the present value of future expected income. So essentially, the higher the discount rate is, the shorter the optimal harvesting period will be. So as a result, plantation forestry generally uses fast-growing softwood trees because the owners of that forest can harvest their timber more frequently. And then this also creates more pressure on old-growth forests because they represent high stock value that can then be replaced with either faster-growing species of tree or agricultural crop. And from an economic perspective, this is financially optimal, but it can lead to significant ecological issues.
All right. So a lot of this is going to tie into what was said previously, as well as some of what will be said in the following slides and by the other people. But I'm going to be talking about forest loss around the world, where it's most prominent, where its effects are most dire, and where you've actually seen some kind of regrowth, surprisingly. So, one of the many examples of the forest that everyone kind of talks about, a lot of people have heard about the Amazon, but a famous example in South America is the Chaco Forest, and this covers Brazil and Paraguay. It's about the size of Poland, but it has lost millions of acres in the recent decades due to the rise of soybean production in less regulated South America. And this is makes sense when you realize that South America, along with Africa, of course, have the highest rates of deforestation of any continents on the Earth. If you look at graph 19.1 in the textbook, it basically shows that Africa had a net annual change in forest area of over 4 million in losses. South America's was around 2.5 million in losses. North and Central America combined didn't really lose much, but still didn't gain. Whereas Europe gained a little, same with Oceania, but Asia is where you've actually seen millions in hectares of forest growth, which seems impressive on surface value. Another, what may somewhat seem as like an optimistic trend, is that deforestation has slowed since the 1990s, and forests cover about 30% of all the Earth's land area still. So to get into forest loss around the world and why it's so disparate in certain places rather than others, I'm going to reference the concept talked about earlier with the lower discount rate pushing the optimal harvesting period. A lot of the older growth forests tend to be more located in less developed countries. And these less developed countries are exactly where you're seeing deforestation really spread. Africa and South America have very less developed areas. And you're also seeing a very concerning trend in tropical forests, which I'm going to get to later. So, to recap on the reason for that, replanting is only lucrative with faster growing trees that can be replaced easily, and as older forests grow slower, old forests suffer from overharvesting, and the profits from immediately deforestation can be invested for high returns compared to harvesting later. This especially applies in South America because the loss there is caused by extremely large agricultural companies, and whereas in Africa, it's caused more by subsistence farmers, so much less decentralized of a trend. Agricultural land conversion. So, a common misconception is that forestry itself might be the biggest cause of deforestation, but it's actually agricultural land. It's clearing the forests for the sake of having agricultural land to either grow crops or sort of raise cattle or animals on. So 26% of deforestation is the result of forestry, but another 50% is due to agriculture, 1% due to urbanization, just 1%, keep that in mind, and 23% is due to fires, which is a interesting amount. And I will point this out later again for a reminder, but newer forests tend to be more vulnerable to fires. And this loss is caused by larger, as I mentioned, companies in South America. But beef, which along with soybeans and palm oil and wood products are responsible for most of this deforestation. Beef is responsible for about 70% of all deforestation. Again, think of all that cattle and think of South America in particular. So, meat consumption reduction would reduce deforestation the most. That's the implication here. Palm oil is related more to Southeast Asia plantations specifically, and industry subsidization in Malaysia and Indonesia for palm oil enterprises is largely what's responsible for the deforestation there. But with Malaysia and Indonesia, this is offset by China, which implemented its Grain for Green program in 1999. And this program has resulted in the conversion of agricultural land to forests and has spent about 82 million US dollars doing so, which sounds like a pretty impressive investment. Now, this all sounds good for Asia, but it's important to note that tropical forest loss might be more harmful than any other form of deforestation, and it's those tropical ones that are particularly vulnerable. They account for less than 10% of all land area on Earth, but two-thirds of all global biodiversity. And so when those get erased, pretty much the tropical deforestation releases more carbon emissions than the entire European Union. So, big factor in climate change, as we were mentioning in other units. And I'll point this out, newer forests, for lack of biological diversity, they're also subject to more wildfires. There's less stopping a fire from spreading everywhere. So if it can go in one area, there's a lot more chances of it kind of jumping around. And all of this combined is to say that some areas have it way worse in terms of the impact of deforestation, while others are much less sensitive to it, but it's still a net negative if it continues to increase, which fortunately has been decreasing since the 90s.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the economic value of land preservation, and a lot of this section is going to relate back to chapter 6 that we looked at, which was titled Valuing the Environment. So first we're going to talk about total economic value, and that is defined as the value of a resource considering both use and non-use values. We also learned in chapter 6 that use values are further distinguished into indirect use and direct use. And then we're also going to look at the costs of land preservation. So we'll start with direct use benefits of land preservation. So this includes things like recreational activities like trail running, backpacking, mountain biking, which have all been seeing increases in the last 20 years. It also includes market uses like extracting tree sap, harvesting nuts, and much more. And it also includes ecotourism, which is defined in our book as environmentally and socially responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment and improves the well-being of local people. So the book also talks about a Balmford study, which was conducted in 2015. It's found that the world's protected areas receive about 8 billion visits per year, and this generates $600 billion in direct expenditures and $250 billion in consumer surplus. The study authors note that these values vastly exceed global expenditures on protected areas, if less than $10 billion per year, highlighting the risks of underinvestment in conservation and suggesting substantially increased investments in protected areas, maintenance, and expansion would yield substantial returns. And these direct use recreational benefits are estimated using travel cost models and contingent valuation, which we learned about in chapter 6 as revealed preference models or stated preference models. So next is indirect use benefits, and this includes ecosystem services that Sarah mentioned, like carbon sequestration, soil stabilization, flood control, pollination by bees, water purification, and much more. So according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, protected areas play a crucial role in securing the long-term delivery of ecosystem services as nature is becoming increasingly degraded or lost elsewhere, including in surrounding areas. Safeguarding these key areas is therefore important not only for biodiversity conservation, but also for sustaining human well-being. Our book cites two studies that examine these protected areas' impacts on ecosystem services and maintaining biodiversity. So a study from Europe showed that protected areas were effective for carbon sequestration, but not for maintaining biodiversity. And a study from China found that reserves were moderately effective at protecting biodiversity, but less effective at maintaining ecosystem services. So our book's authors conclude that these results suggest a need for better management of protected areas to maintain ecosystem services and to create new protected areas where ecosystem services are the most threatened. So next is non-use benefits of land preservation. The non-use benefits of protected areas can only be measured monetarily by contingent valuation, which we also learned about in chapter 6. This is like willingness to pay or willingness to accept. So the book mentions the world's largest national park is Eastern Greenland National Park, which receives only about 500 visitors per year. And it also mentions that at times India has completely prohibited tourism to critical tiger habitat. So in these cases, the primary economic benefits are likely to be these non-use values. Additionally, a contingent valuation study in the Netherlands found that the willingness to pay for the non-use benefits of protected riverbanks was on average 17 times higher than the willingness to pay for recreation benefits. So now to get into the costs of land preservation, while these protected lands obviously offer numerous social benefits, there are also clear costs like having to hire people to enforce regulations and monitor ecological health and providing visitor services. So for some examples, Kruger National Park in Africa spends about $14 million per year on anti-poaching efforts. In 2020, the U.S. Congress passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which provides nearly $10 billion in funding over the next 5 years to partially address a backlog of $20 billion funding on needed infrastructure investment on public lands. And then there are also opportunity costs of foregone values like lost profits, higher consumer prices, and unemployment. And these costs can be particularly significant for low income households living near or even within protected areas, including indigenous people. For example, an economic analysis estimated that the establishment of Ranomafana National Park in Madagascar imposed an opportunity cost of, in US dollars, $19 to $70 per year on local households, mainly due to the loss of access to agricultural land. So now we'll get more into land preservation versus alternative uses. So by measuring total economic value, economic analysis can provide insight into whether protecting particular tracts of land provide more social value than alternative uses. We can compare the total economic value of a tract of land if it is preserved, including direct use, indirect use, and non-use benefits, versus its economic value if it is used for extractive purposes such as timber harvesting or mining. For example, a 2019 study from Australia, compared the recreation benefits of protected areas to the benefits if the land were instead used for crops, livestock, or forestry. So the study found that recreational services provided by these protected areas and other sites can be a similar order of magnitude to, and perhaps even greater than, the extractive uses that are traditionally assigned economic values. It follows that land use decisions that fail to account for these values are unlikely to optimize social benefits from land use allocation. Other research in Thailand regarding intact mangroves shows that they exceed the value of conservation to shrimp farming or conversion to shrimp farming. And also the benefits of wetlands in Canada exceed the value of filling the land for intensive agriculture, and the benefits of forests in Italy for recreation and watershed protection exceed timber values. So now finally, we're going to talk about specifically the economic benefits of urban land preservation. So the book points out that 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas, and that number is expected to increase to 68% by 2050. So because of this trend, the need to preserve and create urban natural spaces is becoming increasingly recognized. So these are some of the following benefits that our book points out as benefits of urban green space. So first, improved quality of life. An increasing amount of studies is finding that exposure to nature can significantly increase human well-being. Higher property values. We also talked about these hedonic studies in chapter 6 that show that green spaces enhance local property values. Provision of ecosystem services. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, daytime temperatures can be up to 7 degrees higher in urban areas as compared to surrounding areas due to a high concentration of buildings that absorb and reflect heat. Also, strengthening community cohesion. So, urban green spaces provide public gathering spaces, which can help create a sense of community. And finally, promoting economic development. So, the book mentions, as an example, the creation of the Discovery Green Park in Houston, Texas in 2008. It has been considered a major factor in attracting millions of dollars in private investment, revitalizing the surrounding urban area.
Okay, so now we're going to get into some policies that promote sustainable forestry, but just to kind of hit back on the main issue, there's that steadily increasing demand for wood products, meat, and crops. And the issue then is the declining natural forest area, and just the fact that multinational companies are able to move their operations relatively easy to find these areas to take. So deforestation and forest degradation account for 11% of carbon emissions. And interestingly enough, this is more than the carbon emissions produced by all the world's cars and trucks. An analysis additionally found that in 2016, effective global forest management could provide 20 to 40% of the total greenhouse gas reductions needed to meet the UN's climate goals. Um, Ultimately, this suggests that we need a need for coordinated international response. And an example of this is the United Nations Forum on Forests. The issue is that these forums are often agreements, but they're non binding and completely voluntary. So, the UN's current approach to forest sustainability is called Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and it was created in 2008. This program provides financial incentives for developing countries in exchange for reducing these emissions and pursuing low carbon development strategies. This was included in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, but again, since a lot of these are completely voluntary, it's hard to make people follow them, especially even if they do, and then they just consider it an option. So then this is just a photo showing what Sarah was talking about with the clear cutting, giving an image to the damage that happens. So, reasons why these policies often fall short are numerous, but the main one is the amount of timber companies pay the national government in royalties to log on public lands instead of straight out buying the land does not cover the negative externalities associated with these operations. So, these are just like the use and non use values. And Oregon estimated that this royalty fee only covers about 2% of the costs. So, some possible solutions to this are a forest tax, which California actually instituted, a 1% tax on lumber and other wood products in 2012. And the money garnered from this is used to fund forest management agencies. The whole question is how effectively and efficiently they're doing this. But moving on, other solutions, you could give tax breaks for sustainable forestry, limitations on clear cutting, and then also requiring that these companies must replant. Additionally, the certification process is approving products that meet certain standards, such as certifying produce grown using organic farming techniques. And this is just making sure that only people who are allowed to do it do. Continuing, there's recycling. Interestingly enough, recycling 1 ton can save 17 mature trees, 7,000 gallons of water, and enough electricity to power an average US home for 6 months. And the book mentions some of the few countries that have the highest paper recycling rates, and the highest of that is South Korea at 85%. So, some private policies to promote land conservation. We'll start with conservation easement, and that is the voluntary agreement in which a landowner agrees to permanently limit the use of their land in order to meet these conservation objectives. And they typically do this in exchange for financial benefits, such as reductions in property taxes or deductions in their income tax. Next, we have zoning restrictions, which is when the government regulates what type of businesses or what type of uses the land is permitted to have. So typical examples of this include commercial development, subdivision housing, mining, and list of others. Another way to promote land conservation privately is formally recognizing Indigenous peoples' land ownership rights, since they're more likely to consider the long-term benefits, not just these short-term opportunities. The persisting issue here is that these people don't often have adequate legal representation and they don't have all the facts, so it makes it hard to make the best educated decision. Lastly, on this slide, we have occasionally organizations will acquire or be gifted land in order to facilitate a move towards these conservation objectives. An example is the Nature Conservancy. This just doesn't happen that often. Moving on to public policies to promote land conservation. Environmental protection is often seen as a public service. So the government provides this environmental protection in an effort to improve their citizens' quality of life. And to fund these endeavors, taxes are often used. Typical example you think of when you think of this is the National Park Service. And other methods are used to do this, like forest reservations and wildlife refuges. The caveat to this is that the same land is used for hunting and other activities, which partially defeats the purpose of making it a protected land. So, looking at this, the World Bank estimates 15% of the world's land is protected to some extent, but due to that caveat, only 5% of the land or 5% of the land is still under intense human pressure. So, the solution to this would be to try and have a buffer zone, which is an area around a core economically or ecologically sensitive area where limited human uses are permitted, which is all to minimize the impacts of these more intensive human uses further from this core area. So, to finish off, policies to promote these public again, the recommendation the book makes is to consider protected lands as a holistic network rather than isolated areas. They say this because only protecting one habitat from migrating animals may not be enough to sustain their population if they're already struggling. So examples of this are humpback whales, monarch butterflies, migratory fish such as shark and stingrays, and all of these are classified as vulnerable species and they do follow migratory patterns. So the idea that they came up with for this is the solution, the conservation or the wildlife corridor, which is land that provides linkage between these protected areas to allow these species to migrate and adapt. So that's our overview on forest and land management. Would ask if you have any questions, but since we're not in class, I guess we won't. Thanks.